There's no reason to believe that psychological properties only begin with us. Why should only we have, or certain animals have, psychological properties and no other systems in the universe have them, even though we're all made of exactly the same matter? Whereas the other way of thinking about it is that, okay, these basic psychological properties exist everywhere. They're manifest in all systems. We observe them even in the simplest systems, having an effect on the behavior. It just makes more sense to me. It's cleaner and simpler just to think of these properties being ubiquitous in nature and organized in very special ways in us. It's a different starting point for science, if you like, but with the new tools and methods we now have, we can do far more sophisticated experiments on systems than we ever have before. And we have a chance really to look and see whether these are playing a role in the evolution of systems.
Welcome to the Apex Energy Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Al-Qattan. Today, my guest is Professor Robert Pepperell. How are you doing today, Robert?
Very good. Yeah, good to see you.
Good. Do you mind just giving a brief introduction into who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm a professor based in the university in the UK. I guess I describe myself as an interdisciplinary researcher. So my background is kind of in art and design, but I've worked for many years across a whole range of fields, from neuroscience to computer graphics, philosophy, and what really interests me, I guess, is bringing knowledge together from lots of different areas of study and trying to make sense of things on a sort of global scale. So yeah, that's my kind of the way I approach these problems. Yeah.
Okay. So I recently read your book called What Matter Feels, and I thought it was fascinating. And you present this interesting hypothesis or conjecture, and it goes as follows. All matter can be considered to have intrinsic psychological properties, meaning in addition to the physical properties we assign, like mass, temperature, and charge, we can also assign psychological ones, the most general of which is experience. What led you to make this conjecture?
Well, I've started from the point of view that everything in the universe is made of energy and matter, as far as we know. I mean, there's lots of subtlety to that, but yeah, that does generally seem to be the case. That there's a consensus around the fact that energy and matter are kind of fundamental features of reality, and we are made of the same stuff. There's nothing different in humans or in brains, for example. It's the same matter and energy that seems to exist everywhere in the universe. So the question I'm addressing in the book is if everything's made of matter and energy, and we're made of matter and energy, we feel, we think, we have experiences, we have pleasures, pains, and so on. So we're systems made of matter and energy that can feel and have minds and thoughts. What makes the matter that we're made of have that capacity and not, say, stones or chocolate or rivers or some other kind of matter? And so really the question is, what makes matter feel, as in the title of the book? Why can we feel, and can everything feel in some sense, is one of the ways to approach it. So I really dug into that question. What if everything is matter and energy, then what possibly could be going on within systems made of matter and energy that allows this mental aspect to appear somewhere in the world? We know it's here because we feel it. How does it get into the world? At what point does it appear? What makes it as it is? And so the conjecture really, and it is no more than a conjecture at this stage, is to say, well, let's just start from the point of view that everything has some kind of experience. All matter and energy have some kind of experience when they interact. And of course, that's a very old idea. Many people have proposed that in many different ways, actually over many thousands of years. It's not even a kind of modern scientific idea or philosophical. It's a very, very ancient idea. But I tried to take that idea extremely seriously and think very deeply and precisely about what it could mean as a physical process that occurs in the world. And so rather than talking about experience in a very general way, I try to think about it in a very specific way, to the point where I've tried to give it quantitative values or measurable values, if you like, that we can do experiments on and test in the same way that we do with other kinds of properties. So I guess that little quote you read out there is a way of expressing this idea that we can treat experience as a property of matter in the same way as we can mass, energy, charge, any of the other many properties we're familiar with that we attribute to matter. Let's just attribute one more, which is experience. Let's not say anything about what it's like, or what it is yet. Let's just say it's possibly there. And by doing that, we've opened the door to allow this mental or psychological aspect of the world to enter into the space of the physical environment that we live in. So it's just a kind of a way to allow the mental to sit alongside the material in a coherent and scientifically testable way. So that's the conjecture. I have to say, I'm not claiming that matter has experience. So I think a few people who've read the book have sort of misinterpreted me in that sense. I don't know whether it does or not, but what we can do using some of the ideas I set out in the book is start to test whether it does, or at least we can test whether thinking about it in that way helps us to understand more of what's going on than we currently do.
Okay. And I do want to ask you then that what is your outlook on reality? Because you use several examples in the book, like Michael Faraday having this theological motivation to try to see the world as joined in or as connected, which led him to the discoveries that he went and discovered. We also use, Descartes and Newton as examples as well. So, what is your philosophical outlook? Would you consider yourself a panpsychist, or would you separate yourself from something like that?
If you take the idea of panpsychism very, very broadly, then yeah, I think that is the view that makes the most sense to me currently. I am careful in the book to separate out the version of panpsychism that many people currently support, which is normally defined as the view that consciousness is a ubiquitous and fundamental property of nature. And for reasons I go into, I don't think that's the most helpful way to think about it. In fact, I think it probably creates more problems than it solves, thinking about consciousness in that way. I think I'd be much more comfortable talking about experience being a fundamental and ubiquitous property of nature in the way I just described. And I think we can build on that to start thinking about what makes certain systems conscious and others not. And then consciousness becomes distinct from experience in that sense. So you can talk about conscious experience as a specific way in which experiences manifest in the world. But I do think you get a lot of problems if you think about that very high level organization existing in very, very simple systems. So yeah, I think there's a very long history of panpsychist thought in science and philosophy, which goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years again. And when I read people who support those views, it definitely intuitively makes a lot of sense to me to think about it in that way. But what I really want to do is go beyond that and look for some kind of empirical way of investigating that as well. And that's really what the book's about.
Do you think Isaac Newton himself would have been sympathetic to this view?
I was very surprised when I read about Isaac Newton. I mean, I'm not a trained scientist by background, so certainly not a physicist or historian of science. But actually, Newton, in my research, became a really key figure in this whole investigation, because my understanding of what Newton did and thought and said and so on has come down through, has been filtered down through generations of interpretations and simplifications. And I was very surprised when I read Newton to find out his kind of worldview was very different from the one I assumed he had. I mean, some people say Newton was not a Newtonian in the sense that many people, following him were Newtonians. He didn't have this view of the world as a kind of cold, soulless material machine. That was probably closer to what Descartes thought. Newton was, as I'm sure you know, he was very devout, religiously devout, and a little bit like Faraday in that sense. And he had a much richer, more organic, more kind of psychologically driven, I would say, view of nature than certainly I had realized. So in places he talks very explicitly. He says, we don't know that all matter is not alive, or all nature is not alive, for example. And he saw a kind of a spirit, or he talks about a mind at large in the universe, which he identified with God. And so, yeah, this was quite surprising to it's not so well known that Newton thought like this. But when you go back then and look at his more scientific writings, for example, his work on motion, for example, and forces, the kind of language he uses there is not totally disconnected from the kind of language he uses in his more kind of esoteric, religiously driven writing, if you like. So you can see the link between his way of thinking about the universe. Of course, we've subsequently, in the history of science and so on, we've tended to kind of lose track or lose sight of his more esoteric interests, alchemy and so on. But there's no doubt in his mind they were deeply interconnected. And I think, there are definitely value and insights we can still draw from that, particularly when we go back to thinking about things like panpsychism and where the mind is in the universe and those kinds of questions. Yeah.
What about someone like Gottfried Leibniz, who had this mill analogy? Do you think he was pointing to a similar framework?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, Leibniz was a very religious person, and I think he was looking for ways to reconcile, his experience of the world with his belief in a divine spirit and so on. And yeah, I think the mill analogy is very interesting on many levels, and there's a chapter in it about the book towards the end. And I don't know if your viewers are familiar with the analogy, but very briefly, he says, imagine if we were to blow up or to enlarge a mill, like a windmill, let's say, which would have been probably one of the most complex bits of technology that people at the time would have known of. Clockwork and mill engines and so on were, for most people, kind of very advanced technology. And he said, imagine if you went inside I guess he's talking about a brain. He said, what if you blew up the brain, or shrunk yourself to the point where you could see all the mechanisms in the brain working, like you can see the cogs and so on turning in a mill. And he said, no matter how small you make yourself, or no matter how big you make the parts, you will never observe the mind at work. You won't see thought, you won't see perception. And this is a fundamentally true fact about nature. Even with the best scanning technologies we now have to look at the brain, we have some amazing kit for studying people's brains, living brains, at very high resolution. You can't see thinking. You can see stuff moving around. You can see matter and energy interacting in various different ways, and you can detect that and image it, but you can't see what someone is experiencing. And so Leibniz is pointing to a really basic truth about nature, which gives us a really important clue, I think, about how we should approach this problem. He says, you just can't see it. You're prohibited from seeing the first person point of view, if you like, of the system that you're studying. And so for Leibniz, this was actually an argument against the idea that minds were generated by brains. So he he had a different idea about what's called parallelism. He thought there was a parallel psychological domain that was separate from, but synced up to the physical domain. So his Mill argument was designed to make that point, really. But I think you can turn the argument around and actually, and the way I do in the book, and say, actually, it points to a possible solution to this mind-body problem, not quite the one Leibniz proposed, but a similar one that actually Spinoza proposed, another philosopher, European philosopher, roughly the same time, and actually Gustav Fechner, who we'll probably come on to later, kind of put into the most kind of best expressed, the most concrete form. So I guess Fechner took Leibniz's kind of idea that there are these two domains, the physical and the mental, that are in sync, and he threw away a lot of the kind of metaphysical baggage, questions that are around that. He said, let's just take that as a kind of practical basis on which to do experiments. Let's just assume that every time I look at a physical object, it could be a brain, it could be a mill, it could be a clock or a watch or a computer, doesn't really matter what it is. Let's just assume that I can look at that thing physically from a physical perspective, and I can watch the matter and energy interact as we can with any system. But crucially, let's also assume that there's a psychological aspect to that system that we can't see, as Leibniz pointed out, but nevertheless is actually there playing a role in its behavior in the same way as the physical bit we can see is playing a role. And in fact, Fechner says those are two parts of the same thing. They're not two separate layers, which probably is closer to how Leibniz put it. They are the same thing seen from two different points of view. And it's what many people today call a dual aspect view. You think of a coin, it has two sides, heads and tails, but it's one coin. You can view it from two different points of view. And Fechner came up with this idea of psychophysicalism, which is this basically combining of the psychological and the physical into one explanatory framework. And it draws on Leibniz, it draws on Spinoza and many other people, but Fechner was the first to put it into a kind of scientifically experimental context, if you like. And that's basically where I start from in the book, by taking Fechner's model and thinking about it in a contemporary scientific context.
Okay. I want to dive into the science empirical part, but I still want to get your opinions maybe on some, philosophical kind of conjectures. When I think of that coin analogy or the moon analogy that you present in the book, those are physically two different points of view. And if we were to consider what it means to be extrinsic or intrinsic, I could take apart someone's brain and put myself inside of it and recapitulate, put it back together, and I still wouldn't be able to see their intrinsic realm. So does this allude it to not being spatially different, or a spatially different point of view? Maybe something temporal, or maybe something else we haven't thought of at all?
No, I think you can make sense of all this in standard physical terms. I don't think we need any new other dimensions or anything like this other than what we know about to make sense of this. The thing that's quite hard to get your head around is the idea of swapping perspectives. I think that's the tricky bit. I mean, I struggle with this myself. It takes a long time. In fact, one of the starting points that triggered this for me, I was sitting in a very hot in a holiday in a very hot country, and I was watching a car, like the bonnet of a car, heat up, and I could see it sort of changing shape as it heated, because it was getting so hot, it was sort of starting to crinkle at the edges. And I sort of just had this thought, what does it feel like to be that piece of metal, being heated up like that by the sun? And many people would probably say nothing, matter doesn't feel anything. But it's an interesting idea to follow through. What if it did feel anything, what would it feel? And what would be the difference between what it feels like as it heats up, and if
Mm,
you threw a bucket of cold water over it, for example.
mm,
So it's this idea of the point of view of the system you're observing is quite a hard thing to flip yourself into, because we think of everything from our point of view naturally. But it does make a kind of sense if you start to think of every system having its own point of view. You know, anything could have a point of view. It probably, in many cases, won't be like ours. You know, even your point of view, we're both very, very similar, you know, in our constitution, but we have different points of view even now. You know, you're looking at me and I'm looking at you.
mm,
And it's very hard, sort of philosophically and psychologically, to accept the point of view of other things, even of other people sometimes. But we have to do that because we know that other things do have points of view. You know, I know you do, and we know animals do, and you know, so that's really the challenge, is how to make that into a kind of coherent scientific model. This combination of the extrinsic and the intrinsic
mm,
perspective. How do we accommodate them both in our model is really the and I would say generally that science tends to adopt only the extrinsic perspective when it's studying things. And you know, I've done lots of scientific experiments myself. I've been involved in lots of studies, including brain studies. And you know, you when you're doing that work, you're looking at things from an outside point of view. If you're studying rocks or planets or weather systems or human
yeah.
brains,
Mm,
you know, that's the standard scientific stance, if you like, that people take.
mm,
We very, very rarely, even in psychology, actually, very rarely think, you know, hard about what's going on inside the system. We're looking for responses that we can record, things we can measure, but
mm,
we're not really giving deep consideration to the system itself. And I think, particularly if we're going to try and understand consciousness scientifically, we have to do that. And we have to start somewhere, understanding
mm,
what the intrinsic nature of matter
mm.
is, if we ourselves are examples of that intrinsic matter thinking. Yeah.
Okay. So you say this example of we are very similar, but I can't see your inside world, you can't see my inside world, but we do have this amazing ability to empathize, and it's a muscle we can develop further and further. And with that empathy, I can become more in tune with your emotions and maybe how you feel on the inside, perhaps some things I did not know or wasn't aware of beforehand. So do you think in some way we could be empathetic to materials and grow that muscle and explore that and uncover, new properties or so on and so forth, a better understanding?
Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it, actually. I hadn't thought about it quite like that, but you're absolutely right that this is a kind of empathetic view of the world, accepting that your point of view is not unique. You know, well, it may be unique, but it's not the only point of view in the world, let's say. And yeah, you're absolutely right. On a human level, we can understand someone else is in pain, for example, and we can empathize with them and we can try and help them, or but obviously we can't experience their pain directly. It may cause us pain to see someone else in pain, and that's again a kind of empathy. But I think you're right. I think we need to be empathetic to the whole world in that sense, and accept, even provisionally, even conjecturally, that all objects have a point of view, all systems have a point of view. In most cases, those points of view won't be very, very interesting. You know, there's most matter in the universe is not doing that much. It's not, if you think about dust in space and cold, distant, dark planets,
Mm,
the matter is not really kind of organized or behaving in any interesting way. So its experience of it being what it is probably not quite. It's probably quite monotonous.
mm,
But clearly there is little pockets of stuff going on, of which we're examples, where the matter and energy is organized in incredibly interesting and complicated ways. And again, that's not unique to us. The flora and fauna of the world and so on.
mm,
There's countless examples, but there's going to be cases where that energy and matter, from its intrinsic point of view, is having some really kind of dynamic and continually changing experiences as it responds to its environment and to its own behavior and structure and so on. So that's really what that's what the focus of the research is. I'm not so much interested in what the experience of a rock might be, 500 light years away, but nevertheless, that's not disconnected with how we are and how we feel. It's not, the universe is, by its very name, universal. So it's looking for those very kind of fundamental basic principles that would apply everywhere in general, but have very specific applications in living systems like us, for example.
I wanted to bring this up to you. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I think Johann Wolfgang von Goethe did a similar kind of way of doing science, and that's how he came up with his theory of color and plant metamorphosis. So, are you familiar with that and how?
A little bit, yeah. No, I mean, I'd like to know. Definitely like to know more. He's come up a few times actually in over the last few years in various ways in this work, and he does seem to be an absolutely extraordinary pivotal figure who influenced scientists and artists and poets and philosophers, as you suggest. And it's a little bit of a shame because there were so many people in the 19th century, including Fechner, Ernst Mach is another one who comes up. So many of these people were really passionately interested in kind of knitting all our knowledge together to make sense of the world. They didn't discriminate between art and science, poetry, philosophy. Well, if they did discriminate, they didn't see them as unconnected, and they were looking for some holistic understanding of nature, which includes aesthetics and beauty and feeling and so on, as well as hard physical behaviors, reactions, laws. And so they seem to all be aware of each other and supporting each other in trying to come to this more holistic understanding. It was very much a culture of, it wasn't unusual to see poems quoted in scientific papers, for example, or references to artwork. So my understanding is Goethe fits very neatly into that tradition, as not seeing art and science, for example, as distinct modes of study, but as having deep interconnections. But I'd certainly like to find out more about him. There's a quote I use from him in the book, actually, which basically says, I can't remember the exact phrase, but he says, there's no matter without spirit and there's no spirit without matter. And it's the same idea really that we've just been talking about, that matter and spirit are sort of deeply integrated into one another, and we're examples of that.
Okay. And I want to ask one more person. Are you familiar with the work of Alfred North Whitehead?
Yes. Again, I'm certainly not an expert in it, but everything I've read of Whitehead sort of confirms in my view that this is more, I'm more or less saying the same thing as him, or I mean, there are many places in his books where I recognize, arguments or ideas. For example, I think he does say that there is this fundamental experience that's an aspect of the world. He makes this distinction between experience and consciousness, for example, that I was talking about earlier. He thinks energy is very important, for example. He talks about it in very similar way to the way I do, about the way the interaction between energy and matter produces this experience and so on. So again, I'm not a Whitehead scholar, but as I say, everything I've read, or much of what I've read, seems to be kind of in deep sympathy with the approach, and also with many other people as well. I mean, he reflects, the work of many other people too. So lots of these ideas are kind of meltings of many streams of thought that have been kind of pouring in together, and you can pick out kind of individual people and concepts, but they all seem to be integrated or connected into this larger, I guess you'd call it panpsychist approach to thinking about nature, you mentioned earlier. So Absolutely, yes. I mean, I have to say I find Whitehead quite hard to read, or maybe hard to understand. Is maybe a better way to put it. I don't think I'm alone in that, but certainly things jump out from the page, and when reading him, that I think absolutely, yeah, that makes complete sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, he considers himself, or the scholars that I've spoken to consider him a panexperientialist, and that's where they
Yeah.
separate themselves. Yeah,
Yeah.
from a
Yeah.
panpsychist, someone who thinks that consciousness is,
Yeah.
everywhere, and yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's probably a better description of my position as well, actually.
Yeah.
I would say probably experience is ubiquitous throughout nature.
Mm.
And when it's organized in very, very specific, special ways, then you can get the conscious form of it, which we are examples of. Yeah.
Mm. Okay, so how could you explain going from non-conscious experience with a capital E to conscious experience, and then how do you go from conscious experience to self-conscious experience?
Yeah. So quite a lot of the book is taken up with describing exactly that journey you've just mentioned there. How do we get from this very basic experiential property of nature, as I define it in the book? And I should probably just start by saying that experience is a very specific product of a very specific process. So it's not just like there in the world. Arbitrarily, it's produced through very kind of defined actions, if you like, and it basically comes from Newton, really, and his laws of motion. It's what something experiences when it's moved against its will, basically. So Newton talks about something that's moving in a uniform way or at rest. In the first law, it will stay like that forever unless something comes along and moves it, an external force, for example. If you think of a billiard ball floating through space, it will just carry on indefinitely until it hits another billiard ball, and then it will change its motion. And that's such a fundamental aspect of nature, this change in motion, which is really what the laws of motion are about. And so what I argue in the book is we can think of that as the equivalent of the experience. So when we observe externally, we observe two things interact, two billiard balls, let's say, clash. We see a change in motion from our point of view. From the point of view of the balls, they experience that change themselves. So they have a feeling, if you like, that their motion is being changed. They would prefer to carry on in the same state as they were, but they can't because an external force changes them. And if you think about us, we are, in a sense, very complex arrangements of lots of billiard balls bashing together, because we're made of, particles and subatomic particles that, interact with each other and get moved around in very highly organized ways. So it's taking that very basic experience that comes from things interacting from their own point of view and thinking about how they kind of map together or nest together in very complex arrangements. And the kind of net effect of lots of these things happening at the same time in lots of different ways produces much more complicated kinds of experiences for the system, let's say. Okay. So that basic kind of idea makes sense. Then I go to think about contemporary neuroscience, and what does contemporary neuroscience tell us about the difference between a conscious and an unconscious person? So, a lot of our lives, we're unconscious. We can be asleep, we can be anesthetized. For whatever reason, we can lose consciousness. We're even not that conscious of what we're looking at now. I'm looking at you, but there's a lot of stuff going on in my periphery that you could argue I'm experiencing, but I'm not consciously experiencing. If something changes over here, I will pay attention to it. So what does contemporary neuroscience tell us about the difference between a brain or a person that's consciously experiencing the world and not consciously experiencing the world? And in the last 10 or so years, it's become pretty clear what that difference is, in terms of our understanding of the neurobiology and the organization. It's basically the idea that someone whose brain is conscious, or a person whose brain is conscious, is in a very specific state when they're conscious that it's not in when they're not. And that basically is a state in which the activity in the brain and the organization is highly differentiated. So it's very, very diverse. There's lots of very, very different things going on in very different parts of the brain simultaneously. But at the same time, it's also highly integrated in that all those different bits, all those different pockets of activity, if you like, are talking to each other or affecting each other in some way. And if a brain is very differentiated but not integrated, then you're probably not conscious. If it's very integrated but not differentiated, you're probably not conscious. But if the two come together and you're in this very special state, the chances are that you are conscious. And very, very many studies now have shown this, very reliably to be the case. It's been measured in lots of different ways using lots of different techniques. And so going back to what we were saying before, if you think about all these experiences that are going on in a brain, let's say, because of the way the particles are bumping into each other in that brain, most of that will not be consciously experienced, because most of the time it won't be sufficiently differentiated and integrated. It needs a very special kind of organization to make that happen. If it does happen, then you get this overall sense of conscious experiences that we enjoy. But it's very fragile. It's very kind of spasmodic. It changes all the time. It comes and goes during the course of a day. It varies in strength and intensity and so on. It's a very kind of complex and multifaceted thing. But there's no reason to believe it's not essentially the product of a lot of particles, a lot of bits of matter being moved around by energy. And there's a lot of clues in the neurobiology of consciousness, particularly when you think about energy, for example. So the brain is the most, it consumes the most energy of any organ in the body. At rest, it consumes about 20% of your whole energy budget, even though it's only about 2% of your body's mass. So if you think about how much energy is being used up just by your brain, even when you're not thinking or doing anything, difficult. In fact, when you do complex tasks, very often your energy consumption increases, but only by a very small amount. It's not like suddenly everything starts firing. The brain's working all the time. There's always stuff going on, and it's always consuming a lot of energy. If that energy gets cut off, you lose consciousness very, very quickly. And so there's a very deep relationship between the supply of energy, the consumption of energy in the brain, and your ability to sustain your consciousness and your awareness. And so really what this points to, I think, is back to this relationship between energy and matter being organized in very particular ways. And when it is, you get this special state, this kind of emergent state, which is very expensive to maintain, energetically speaking, but gives us this coherent sense of experience that we wouldn't have if we were not conscious. It doesn't mean to say we're not still experiencing. We can still have experiences, but we needn't necessarily be conscious of them, and that's the distinction. Onto the point about self-consciousness, again, that's another layer of organization and complexity that you add in, and one of the mechanisms by which that may be supported is very complex loops, feedback loops within the brain and within the neural system that are feeding signals back round and round again, slightly modified, and feeding them to other parts of the brain, which are then sending them back slightly modified. And so you get this sort of self-reflexive behavior going on in the system when you're not just aware of what's coming in from the world, let's say, what's coming in from your senses, but you're aware of your awareness of what's coming from your senses, or you're aware of how you feel about what you're sensing. So there's another layer of processing on top of the kind of raw sensory response to the world. And the integration of all those senses, all those feelings about feelings, if you like, are part of what it means to have a self, to feel coherent as a self being. So again, I go into this in some detail in the book and talk about the mechanisms that might support this kind of state. So it's based on neuroscience, but it's not. None of this is proof that this is what's going on. It's just a way of telling a story about how we might get from very, very simple experiences at a fundamental physical level, and how we might build them up in layers over time and in complexity to get to something like our self-conscious experience, without there being a big gap in there somewhere, without there being an explanatory gap where we can't get from one step to the next. There's a lot more detail that we could put in to fill in the story, but to the best of my knowledge, there isn't a fundamental missing piece that prevents us getting from the material level to the mental level. And that was really this kind of aim of the book, was to set out a story that would allow us to have that continuity between the physical and the psychological.
You mentioned this part in the book. You say previously I've likened the complexity that emerges from the self-referential looping to the extraordinary patterns that blossom in video feedback systems when a camera views its own output. Could you tell me more about that?
Yeah, I mean, when I in a previous life, when I was much younger, I used to be a VJ. I used to do visuals for clubs and bands and things, and I was I got involved in sort of early use of computer graphics to do live shows and in various different venues. And I think it was around about 1985 or 86. I was in someone's studio in London, and they showed me some video feedback which I'd never seen before, and I was just absolutely astonished. And if no one's seen it, they should just look it up on YouTube, and you'll see many examples. But yeah, you're right. I think it still works with digital cameras, but it certainly, when in the days of analog video, if you pointed the camera at the TV that the camera was plugged into, you get a kind of tunnel effect, which probably most people have seen. A bit like if you put two mirrors together, you see a kind of reflection of a reflection and so on. But if you tilt the camera just right, you have to get this very critical, quite sensitive conditions. But if you get the camera tilted just right, this tunnel sort of, or blossoms is a good word, it sort of spontaneously turns into a very complex, organic looking pattern. It looks a bit like flowers or water ripples or something, pulsating, and it's not where that pattern comes from is very interesting. I mean, it's to do with the physics of the system that's generating it. But the point about it is it's generated by the system looking at itself. That it's a self-referential system. In fact, several people have talked about this before. I'm not the only one by any means to talk about this. Douglas Hofstadter, for example, did a book called The Strange Loop, or A Strange Loop, which was more or less the same idea. And in fact, it's a very old idea in Buddhism that consciousness comes from the brain looking at itself, looking at itself, looking at itself. So it's just this analogy. In nature, you get these situations where things can self-reflect. And rather than just, that being a redundant process, can actually generate this highly organized, very special state, this emergent state of great complexity, which is intrinsically very beautiful as well. Has a very aesthetic feel to it. And funnily enough, when I first saw that, this was right back in the 80s, my first thought was, that's what consciousness looks like. And I don't know why I thought that, but somehow something went off in my head, I thought that's got to have something to do with how we're conscious. And it took me many, many years to kind of break that down and think about what that might mean physically. But it goes back to actually what we're just saying about these loops in the brain. There are more loops coming from the visual cortex down to the center of the brain. There's more loops coming down from the brain to the visual receptive area than there are coming in from your eyes. In other words, that what's going on in your brain is having more influence on what you're seeing than what's coming in through your eyes.
Wow.
So these loops are ubiquitous throughout the brain. And it's not hard to imagine them as kind of feedback loops that are generating this highly complex states that don't exist when you have a linear structure. So yeah, how close that analogy is to actually what's going on in the brain, who knows? But it's certainly suggestive and evocative of other natural processes where we see similar things happening. Yeah.
Okay. I'd love to go into a different direction now and just go over the specifics of your hypothesis, your conjectures, and some of the terms that you have. So I'm just gonna share my screen real quick. So you present this table, and can you see?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so just for the viewer to understand some of these definitions that we will be using. So experience you've mentioned before is energy or the change in energy, delta E,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And you give it its own units, its own symbol, the formulas, the formulae that are associated with it in different contexts. Then we have repose, which you define as static or dynamic equilibrium, right? And static equilibrium is, from what I understand, in simple systems, like a spring, where the equilibrium is just, at rest. Or dynamic equilibrium is more so like our own brains, things that, okay, that's correct. And then, so I want to understand, like, what made you use these definitions like will, nolition, conflict, volition? I mean, these are all very teleological words, right? It supposes that, the material that is doing something, it is has a purpose or has a goal that it wants to reach. Was that intentional, or was that just like a byproduct of, having it or giving it a psychological kind of term?
I mean, probably a bit of both, really. I mean, I have to say, I'm probably not the first person to try and do this. There are a few examples of people having done various versions of this in the past. Ernst Mach, for example, was a very eminent physicist in the 19th century. He sort of hinted at some similar kinds of proposals, but he didn't go to quite the same extent that I've gone to here. In fact, there was a philosopher who's got a very similar name to mine, William Pepperell Montague, who was a colleague of William James, actually,
Wow.
in the USA in the early 20th century. He had a very similar idea in terms of the relationship between energy and consciousness. And he actually did a table of properties of matter, which have some similarities with what I'm proposing here. So just to say, there are some kind of precedents for this approach, but I'm not aware of anyone who's sort of gone to the extent of defining as many of them as I have here. It all starts really with the first one, which is experience and energy. And again, this is not, the various people have claimed this kind of equivalence between the two. Probably the most prominent is Fechner. Fechner said basically there's psychological energy and there's physical energy. He called psychic energy and physical energy. And he said, really, they're going back to the coin thing. They're two sides of the same coin. So I'm calling psychic energy experience, just for the sake of clarity and convenience, and arguing that they're basically equivalent, both in terms of being the same thing, but also being quantitatively the same as well. So you have a certain amount of energy you have a certain amount of experience, and that follows from the fact that they are being treated as the same thing. Now, that's probably as far as most people have ever gone, but what I've tried to do on top of that is add some other properties that do seem to be parts of nature. So for example, the idea that a spring, when you stretch it, wants to go back to being in an unstretched state is a very basic observation. There's nothing magic going on there. We pull a spring, it clearly wants to be back, in the state it was before we pulled it. And if you let go of it, it will go back to that state. And we find that everywhere in nature, all over the place. In fact, physicists do this all the time. One of my sort of little hobbies is keeping notes of physicists and chemists, actually, and other people who say, system X wants to be in state Y. There are many. James Clerk Maxwell, for example, in 1877 said a ball experiences being pushed in the opposite direction to the one it's moving in. So there are many, many examples of this about physicists who probably, well, when I ask them, say that they're not saying this, but do speak about systems wanting or desiring or preferring to be in one state or another. So all I'm really doing is formalizing that language. People use that language quite loosely. If you ask them, they say, well, I just mean it, it's just an analogy or a way of explaining stuff. But I'm proposing, let's give it real substance and value. Let's say the spring does want to go back, and that we can measure that wanting in the same way that we measure, the change in motion. Okay, it sounds a little bit weird to do that, but the payoff may be substantial if we can then do the same thing when we think about organic systems like brains and nervous systems. So whilst it may seem odd in the case of a spring that we'd say it wants to be at repose, as I put it, it wants to be at equilibrium. And in fact, I go further and say that when you pull the spring away from equilibrium, it actually feels unpleasant for the spring to be pulled in that way. That's a negative experience for the spring. Letting it go back is a positive experience because you're letting it do what it wants to do. And so we have these, we don't just have experience, we start to have these flavors of experience, if you like, that we obviously manifest in ourselves. We want, we desire, we prefer, we feel pain, we feel pleasure. We're matter. Why should not? Why should other material systems not feel the same? So it's coming up with a kind of menu of flavors, if you like, of experience that seem to bear a relationship to how things actually behave in the world. So they're not things that don't have any correspondence in the physical world, but it's giving them a precise value and a measurable value, rather than just treating them as loose phrases, which is how they tend to be treated, in order that we can start to do experiments on real systems to see what role they may or may not be playing. And that's really the value. Yeah. Okay.
So I have this, I kind of lay out here the difference between the extrinsic equation or force, the spring constant, and the distance in which it changes. So just as you mentioned, so the force here would be considered conflict. That's its equivalent, right?
Yeah.
So by exerting force, we are causing a conflict, and the distance in which it changes is distress. It's moving away from equilibrium, correct?
Yeah.
And as I let go of the spring, it tries to go back to equilibrium, and that's relief.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay, and then we have these, other terms as well, like, will and notion, nolition, sorry, not notion, and volition. Okay, so I want to ask, later on in the book, you talk about how you compare the spring to, a living organism. You essentially say that there may be a difference in symmetry between the spring, whereas the spring has a stable, symmetrical kind of boring, okay, it feels the distress, it goes back to relief, it's sitting there. Whereas with living organisms and with us, obviously, there's an asymmetrical relationship, whereas it's kind of like pulled forward and wants to experience new ways of reaching relief. Is that a way? Is that correct?
Yeah, and again, that's a good way to put it. So I say as a general principle, systems are trying to avoid pain, so they're trying to avoid being pulled away from their preferred state, if you like. But they're also trying to maximize their pleasure, if you like. And this is where it gets interesting when you think about complex systems. Springs have there's not much a spring can do. It can be pulled or or not.
Yeah.
But very complicated systems, and this is a speculation I talk about at the end of the book in the chapter about Schrodinger's book, What is Life? That there may be an incentive for a system not only to minimize its pain, which is the same as minimizing its energy, really, its free energy, but also to organize itself in such a way that it's maximizing its relief or its pleasure. And I think about this a little bit like a child in a playground, who will climb up a slide in order to have the fun of sliding down. You have to put work in to climbing up the ladder. That's effort, but the reward is that you get this kind of fun experience as you come down the other side. And this is really, speculative, and I think, but something that could be experimentally tested is whether systems organize themselves so on average or on balance, they undergo more relief than they do distress. And that, if that turns out to be the case in any way, in any system, that would be very interesting, because it suggests that this psychological motive does play a role in the self-organization of systems, particularly living systems, not even ones as complicated as us. Maybe single cell organisms, for example, have enough complexity in them and enough capacity for self-organization to be able to maximize their psychology as well as their physiology in order to maintain their state. So you think of things like reward and punishment for going into the wrong way or moving in the right way. For us, there's a sensation. We feel pain if we do the wrong thing. We feel pleasure if we do the right thing. Clearly, there's a feedback between sensation and behavior. And whether that occurs in much simpler systems is interesting to consider. But the framework you just had up on the screen there gives you measurable quantities with which to do those tests to see whether they play a role, or at least they're a starting point. My guess is they're probably wrong. They're the best effort to come up with an initial starting set. In reality, when we do the experiments, we'll probably have to refine them and come up with better ones. But at least we can get off the experimental starting block and look at the psychological behavior of a system as well as its physical behavior at the same time.
Okay. So it's not at first point of view, I brought this that table up to people and they say it just looks like a rebrand of, classical Newtonian physics. You're just using different words and different names. How would you respond to that? Yeah.
That's true of a number of the first 4 or 5. I think that is true, but actually there's some new properties in there which don't have a counterpart in standard classical physics. There's some new derivatives of direction, for example, of energy change, and there's also some time derivatives of those as well. So joy, shock, for example. To the best of my knowledge, these are new properties. We don't measure these things at the moment. And I speculate or propose that these may play a role in the behavior, in the intrinsic behavior of a system. But again, we won't know till we do the tests. But yes, there's some new properties in there. And in fact, I've been doing some work with a physicist and modeling some of this stuff. And already, just by putting relief and distress into a model of a gas, let's say, you see a new property emerging from that system, a new macroscopic property, which is its overall state of distress or relief at any one time. It's a bit like temperature or pressure, which is like a global property of a system based on the interactions between its individual parts, if you plug in some of those values on that table, you do get to observe a new macroscopic property of a system. So it's pointing to a possible kind of new physics or new branch of physics, if you like, which is actually what I think Fechner would have called psychophysics originally. This is originally what Fechner was trying to do. Psychophysics for him was just putting psychology and physics together in the same framework, and doing the experiments at both ends to see how they interact. And so, yeah, I think it's certainly the very early attempts to do this are promising in showing that A, there are new properties to play with, and B, there are new properties that seem to emerge if you put them in and start to run the systems.
Okay. Yeah. And I think another bridge, as you mentioned, is like this parallel you make between Erwin Schrodinger's negative entropy and that model and how living systems come to be. And you compare that with the psychophysical model, that framework that you're presenting, and it kind of makes sense. And you mention, or you write about how when you put it together, it's essentially the system is trying to maximize its pleasure and minimize the distress. And from a psychological point of view, that obviously that makes sense to us. It's the pleasure principle, right? It's what Sigmund Freud talked about and all this.
Yeah.
But applying that to a physical system, it would also make sense, which would put some more weight to what you're saying as well. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, there's no reason to believe that psychological properties only begin with us. It's like, why should only we have, or certain animals have, psychological properties, and no other systems in the universe have them, even though we're all made of exactly the same matter?
Yeah.
It just seems a little bit, you'd have to defend that argument quite strongly for it to stick, I think. Whereas the other way of thinking about it is that, okay, these basic psychological properties exist everywhere. They're manifest in all systems. We observe them even in the simplest systems having an effect on the behavior. In most cases, they're not that interesting. As I said before, they're pretty monotonous and predictable. But in these complicated systems, they may be playing an absolutely crucial role in how those systems are organized in a way that you can't see externally for the reasons Leibniz pointed out, but which we can now measure, start to measure at least, with these new properties, which we can, observe based on the physical behavior. It makes more sense to me. You said earlier, what's your philosophical view? It just makes more sense to me. It's cleaner and simpler just to think of these properties being ubiquitous in nature and organized in very special ways in us. And we can think about the neurobiology of how that happens. That's a project for the neuroscientists, which I'm not. That's their problem to work out how that. But if they've got these basic properties to work with to begin with, then they can start to see, okay, how are these being used by the brain to maximize our behavior, to make us move and act and feel in the way we do, in order that we survive and breed and whatever else it is that we do. So it's a different starting point for science, if you like, thinking about this psychophysical approach. It's not new, as I say. Fechner is the one who originated it. But with the new tools and methods we now have, we can do far more sophisticated experiments on systems than we ever have before. And we have a chance really to look and see whether these are playing a role in the evolution of systems.
Have you had any pushback from these types of ideas? I mean, it seems to me that teleology, animism, experience, apart from us, has kind of been a cardinal sin in science. There's kind of been this people have been stuck, scientists and philosophers, in this Cartesian worldview, and that's being even pushed off. The mind part has been sawed off, and it's just been material. Everything is supposed to be random, and evolution has no purpose, and you're not supposed to speak of things as having goals. So, how's the response been on your end?
I mean, I haven't had many people. I agree with you that that would be a lot of people's objections, and I think probably many people would dismiss the ideas in the book outright, without really looking at them. And you've clearly read them and thought about them, but I think a lot of people probably would take the view you just expressed there and say, yeah. When I know a lot of panpsychist philosophers get the same pushback, and from so-called hard scientists. I think I say in the book somewhere, I find it really strange that we went with Descartes rather than Newton. Descartes set out, as you said, set out this very black and white view of the world in which, you've got this mental stuff and you've got this physical stuff. In fact, in a few places, he does recognize that they're not as distinct as we might think. He does try later on in his work to sort of bring them together in some way. And there's a couple of passages where he says, even though they look like they're different, they're actually the same or parts of the same. So
wow.
Even Descartes wasn't a Cartesian in the same way that, Newton wasn't a Newtonian, let's say. But you're right. Generally speaking, we've tended to side with Descartes as the scientific paradigm rather than Newton, whereas Newton was a much more organic, animistic thinker than Descartes was. And in many ways was a much more profound scientist than Descartes. He had much greater influence on science and mathematics than Descartes did, but we somehow haven't followed his worldview. We've gone with Descartes. I mean, there's all kinds of historical reasons why that would be, but I'm very aware of the point of view expressed, and I thought like that myself for a very long time. It seems to make sense that we would treat matter as dumb, numb, and insensitive. But it's only been a very, very short period in which we've thought like that. You only have to go back to the beginning of the 20th century, actually. But certainly the 19th century, you find, I mean, we've mentioned Goethe, but Ernst Haeckel, who was a very important biologist and artist, was absolutely convinced that matter was sensitive, and all matter has sensitivity. There was a cosmologist, Zollner, who thought that planets and comets had feelings, and that's what the planetary motions were based on feeling as much as they were on gravity and so on. So right throughout the 19th century, it wasn't just a respectable view, it was the dominant view. It was the most widely accepted view. Ernst Haeckel did this book called Monism, The Riddle of the Universe, which was an international bestseller in about 1901, I think. And it's basically outlining this view that the whole universe is sensitive. Matter has feelings. It feels good when you move it one way. It feels it feels bad when you move it away from its preferred state. It feels good when it goes back, exactly as we've been talking about. And people in the hundreds of thousands were reading this stuff, and it must have seemed absolutely, standard scientific view. Somehow in the intervening 100 or so years, we've switched completely and gone back to Descartes. I don't know why that would be, but it's certainly an anomaly in the history of thought that we would think in that way. When you look at the much longer picture, going back to the ancient Greeks, and you think about, East Asian philosophies and so on. So I think just because people think it doesn't mean it's true. And part of the reason I'm so keen to get the ideas in this book out is because it goes beyond being merely an opinion. We can start to do actual experiments, and I think that's we can all have our views, but when we get to do real experiments on real systems and get real data, and we can interpret it and analyze it, and then do new experiments, a lot of these arguments become move beyond the merely kind of speculative and start to become empirical. And I think that's where it gets really interesting. And actually, that's probably the only way we're going to settle this either way, is to find out whether this actually does make a difference to the behavior of systems and how we do the science.
Do you think maybe this bias towards mechanistic materialism, let's call it, was political? Maybe it was the church, scientists trying to separate themselves from animism, from the church, all these kind of woo-woo things, and a way to rid themselves of dogmatic belief. And we're dealing with that 300 years later still.
Yeah, very, very possibly. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that would be one of the things that played into it. Science trying to differentiate itself from religion, for example, would make a lot of sense. There's an interesting so in one passage in Descartes, he talks about when he's talking about his mechanics, he's talking about a ball moving around or whatever it is. He says the ball strives to maintain its position or something like that. He said that he used the word strive. And then he says a bit later, by the way, when I said strive, I didn't actually mean it strives. I didn't mean it has any thought about doing this. I want to make clear that it's doing it without any kind of mental aspect to it at all. And so he was clearly aware of the implications of what he was saying, that it could be construed in that way. Whereas Spinoza said it used exactly the same word, strive, but he said it specifically does mean the ball is thinking. So we had these two very clear, this is going back several hundred years, we have these two very clear points of view, just as we do today, with some people saying this matter must have some kind of mental capacity, otherwise a lot of other stuff doesn't make sense. And other people saying, no, you're making an error in attributing mental properties to totally inert, dumb matter. It's just a fallacy. It's a superstitious form of animism. Yeah, we have these two views, and we've had them for hundreds of years, by the looks of it. I think the reasons why that split it carries on would be very interesting. But as I say, we now have an opportunity to resolve it, or to begin to resolve it experimentally by thinking about the world in this way. And that for me is more interesting ultimately, because it's more than people just expressing their point of view. It's about real experiments we can do on real systems.
How could this framework be applied to fields, akin to electromagnetic fields?
Well, I think it's the same. It's the same idea, really. I mean, if you think of the field as I mean, Richard Feynman talks about this in his lectures on physics. He says, that a test particle will feel the force of a field, and he actually uses the word feel, and that's how we know that the particle's there, because it will feel that effect. And so, the field is the means, the vehicle through which the energy is transferred to the body, if you like, or to the particle. It doesn't really matter where that energy comes from, whether it's in the form of a field or of a charge or a mechanical motion. It doesn't matter to the particle, in the sense that it's being moved from it's being affected in some way by the energy that it's absorbing, and that's the cause of its experience. That's really the kind of universal principle that's being proposed here. It's what I haven't looked at in any detail at all is what happens in this model when you start thinking about things at the quantum scale, because I'm really only talking about the sort of classical, mechanical Newtonian scale of things here. I've had a few conversations with people, and there are other things you need to take into account, but there doesn't seem to be any reason in principle that I've come across so far that the same principle wouldn't apply at the quantum mechanical scale, or even at the grand cosmological scale. It doesn't seem to matter what scale you're operating at, I suppose. These principles seem to kind of be universal at all scales, even if the mechanism by which they're carried out may vary tremendously.
And I think, it sounds like it would be more favored, because people talk about, obviously in the quantum realm, it's all energy, and it would, I think fit in really nicely there. And some people theorize that, consciousness arises from quantum processes and so on and so forth.
Exactly. Yeah. No,
Okay.
Consciousness has to come from somewhere. It has to be, has to get into the physical world through some kind of channel or some kind of mechanism. Various people have proposed various options. There are many options out there, as I'm sure you know. This is just another option, about how to think about it. I'm not claiming it's the best one or the only one, or the one that's bound to work. It's just one that seems to make sense based on what we know about other physical systems and how they behave.
Okay, Robert, I'd like to ask you now one final question. just to like, put a bow ribbon on this conversation is, can you tell me the parallels between the essay written by Rudolf Arnheim called Entropy in Art and how that relates to your framework? So bridging it into aesthetics and art.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. So the last chapter, I think, in the book is about aesthetics, about beauty, really, and form and nature. Why certain forms appear in nature and why we think they're either beautiful or ugly. And it actually starts with a quote from Michael Faraday, because Michael Faraday talked about beauty all the time. It's another thing that surprised me reading Michael Faraday's notes about his experiments and his thoughts on how the universe worked. He frequently says, I find beauty in these experiments. I find a beautiful pattern emerging, and so on. And so it starts from that with Faraday's observations on the beautiful forms that spontaneously appear in nature. And Rudolf Arnheim, whose book Entropy in Art, should be better known. I think it's a very short book, but I think actually, we were talking earlier about bringing together ideas from lots of different disciplines to try and make more holistic sense of the world. And this tiny book is a brilliant example of that being done. He was a psychologist. He was trained in the Gestalt School of Psychology, but he was also an art historian. And he was looking for, again, like fundamental principles that might drive preferences, feelings, aesthetic forms in nature and in art. And he focused on the notion of entropy, which I'm sure many people listening to this will know of. It wasn't the same kind of entropy that many people talk about today, which is sort of computational or information theoretic entropy, which is a more modern kind of version of the concept. For Arnheim, he was thinking about it more in this sort of 19th century sense, as what happens when the energy in a system kind of levels out or stabilizes. So if you imagine a dam, for example, where you've got a lot of water on one side of a dam and far less on the other, the water on the higher side wants to go down. It's like we were saying earlier, it wants to get to equilibrium. And if you open up the dam, or there's a breach in the dam, it will do that. There's no doubt about it. So system where energy is imbalanced in a system, it will always try and kind of find what I call repose or an equilibrium. And entropy, in a way, is a measure of the change that happens when it goes from the high energy to the low energy state. And that's really how Rudolf Arnheim's talking about it. For example, if you drop ink into water, it will spread out into its most uniform energetic state that it possibly can. But Arnheim shows many examples of this occurring in nature. And we can see it all around us in all kinds of organic forms. But he crucially took from the Gestalt psychologists this idea that the brain is doing the same thing, that the brain is an energy dissipating system. It takes energy in through food and nutrition, and it has to get rid of it because it creates an imbalance in the brain, that it has to be, like the water has to go downhill somehow. And it's through going downhill in certain ways. It's the way the brain finds it most easiest and quickest to go downhill are the forms that we then see in the world and in our own minds, if you like. So there's a correlation between the patterns that form in our, and they actually talk about fields, energy fields in the brain. There's a pattern that forms in our physical brains, which is energy going from higher to lower states all the time. In doing so, it's creating these organic-like patterns, which we experience from our own point of view as feelings, in exactly the same way that flowers and sand and clouds and other things are formed in nature. And what artists do is they act as intermediaries between those. So artists come up with forms that have these natural properties that we see in nature, but they're sort of heightened, if you like. They're concentrated into very specific patterns, which trigger these patterns in our own brains, which we feel as being good or bad, depending on what the artist does. So the artist is kind of playing with the forms in our brains, if you like, with the energy patterns in our brains, through the energy patterns that they create in the works. And the example he gives is a sculpture of a woman holding, like a religious figure holding a baby, and he talks about the tension and the imbalance and the balance and the kind of the way in which different forces interact and reach a kind of stasis within the sculpture. And those forces are kind of embodied in the sculpture because of the way the artist has organized them, but they also get replayed in our own brains as we look at the sculpture. Those tensions and balances and so on of energy are also replicated in our brains at the same time. And this is how he makes this connection between physical form and aesthetic experience. They're bound together by the forces, tensions, balances that are inherent in all of them. It's a very it's a very powerful idea, and one that for me has a huge amount of explanatory power. If you were to really, it's a very short book, and all he does is really introduce the idea, but it could have extraordinarily potent explanatory potential if we were to now, given up the way we can scan brains, for example, with incredible detail, could we find these patterns that he implied were there when people look at certain kinds of works of art? Is there a correlation between the physical form of the painting, let's say, and the structure that our brain takes on when we're perceiving it? He argued there was, but we've never been able to find it experimentally. But it certainly suggests this profound relationship between pattern in nature, pattern in us, and our experience of nature on a psychological level.
Okay. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation, Robert. Is there anything you want to leave the viewer with?
No, I mean, I think hopefully it's all made sense. I mean, it's great that I really appreciate the fact you've read the book and thought about the ideas as well, and I've taken them seriously. But yeah, that's great. That's really helpful to have someone in coming at it from that point of view. So I do appreciate you having taken the time to do that and come up with such thoughtful questions. It's good fun. Thank you. Yeah, I've enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Cheers. Thank you.